Lieutenant Sungmin took command of what remained of the expedition. There were only 235 soldiers left alive, and many of those were wounded or sick. The medical supplies had been nearly exhausted, and Insu was performing triage on a daily basis, deciding who could be saved and who couldn't. The ridge camp had become a nightmare of makeshift graves and desperate survivors. Morale was gone. Discipline was crumbling. Soldiers sat in their tents staring at nothing, their minds unable to process any more death or suffering. Some talked about just walking into the forest and ending it quickly, rather than waiting for Earth to kill them slowly. Sungmin refused to let them give up. He walked through the camp every day, talking to soldiers, checking on the wounded, maintaining the pretense that there was still hope. Taijun admired the effort even as he doubted its effectiveness. "We need to move," Sungmin told his remaining officers on the 18th day. "This position is indefensible. We're too exposed." "Move where?" someone asked. "Everywhere on this planet is a death trap," Sungmin pointed to the map display. "There's a cave system 15 kilometers north. Natural shelter, defensible entrance, protection from weather and large predators. If we can reach it, we might be able to hold out long enough for rescue." Bora looked up from her communications equipment. "I still can't reach the fleet. For all we know, they've written us off as lost." "Then we survive anyway," Sungmin said firmly, "because that's what soldiers do. We adapt and we survive." The march began the next morning. 235 soldiers, many limping or being carried by comrades, trudged north under a gray sky. They moved slowly, stopping frequently to rest, constantly scanning for threats that could come from any direction. Taejun walked near the front of the column with Bora beside him. She looked exhausted, dark circles under her eyes, her communications pack seeming to weigh more with each step. But she kept moving, kept trying to send signals into the static, refusing to give up. "Do you think anyone will ever know what happened here?" she asked during one rest stop. "If we survive, they will," Taejun replied. He had the survival manual tucked into his pack, along with a journal where he had been recording everything they had experienced. Somewhere in his mind, he had accepted that survival meant bearing witness. The temperature dropped as they traveled. Medical Officer Insu checked his instruments and delivered more bad news. "Winter is coming early," he told Sungmin. "The seasonal shift is more extreme than our climate data predicted." "Of course it is," Sungmin muttered. "Everything about this planet is worse than predicted." They reached the cave system on the 21st day. The entrance was a dark opening in a hillside, large enough for several soldiers to walk through side by side. Sungmin sent scouts inside first, making sure the caves were empty of predators. When they returned with the all-clear signal, the soldiers filed in gratefully, seeking shelter from the wind that had grown noticeably colder. The caves extended deep into the hillside, a network of tunnels and chambers that offered protection, but also the danger of getting lost. Sungmin designated the largest chamber near the entrance as their base, posting guards at the tunnel mouths and organizing the remaining supplies. That first night in the caves felt almost safe. The stone walls blocked the wind, and small fires could be maintained without fear of being seen by predators. The soldiers slept more soundly than they had in weeks, wrapped in what remained of their thermal gear. But safety was an illusion, as always. The temperature continued dropping. Within 3 days, soldiers were waking to find frost on their gear. Within a week, several had developed frostbite on their extremities. Their equipment, designed for temperate climates, was inadequate for the cold that Earth's winter brought. 4 soldiers froze to death in their sleep. Insu found them in the morning, their bodies stiff and cold despite the thermal blankets. He stopped trying to save everyone after that. There weren't enough supplies and there were too many ways to die. The food situation became critical. The expedition had planned for regular resupply from the orbital fleet, not for months of isolation. Hunting parties went out daily, trying to kill game for meat. But half the time they came back empty-handed or came back minus 1 or 2 members who had been picked off by Earth's predators. Taejun went on a hunting expedition with 5 others. They tracked a large animal through the snow, following prints that looked promising. When they finally found it, Taejun's database identified it as a moose, a massive herbivore with horns that spread wider than a man's arm span. The creature seemed docile until they tried to approach. Then it charged, moving with shocking speed for something so large. Its horns caught one soldier and tossed him aside like a toy. Its hooves trampled another into the snow. The hunting party fired desperately, finally bringing the animal down, but not before it had killed 3 of them. Taejun and the 2 other survivors dragged the dead moose back to camp, a journey that took hours in the snow. The meat represented salvation for the starving soldiers, but only if they could prepare it properly. They didn't. Most of the soldiers had no experience with processing wild game, and Insu's medical knowledge didn't extend to food safety beyond basic principles. Half the camp ate the undercooked meat and developed food poisoning within hours. The medical tent, such as it was, overflowed with soldiers suffering from violent illness. 17 died over the next 2 days. Their bodies were carried outside and left in the snow, too frozen to bury, joining the growing collection of corpses that marked their camp as a place of death. Bora fell ill on the 28th day, not from food poisoning but from an infection that had started in a cut on her hand and spread despite Insu's best efforts. She developed a fever that wouldn't break, shaking with chills even wrapped in every blanket they could spare. Taejun sat beside her, holding her hand, watching helplessly as his closest friend faded. She was delirious by the 2nd day, calling out for people who weren't there, sometimes seeming to recognize Taejun and sometimes not. "Tell them," she whispered during a moment of clarity. "Tell them what Earth is really like. Don't let more people die because of bad information." "I will," Taejun promised. "You can tell them yourself when we get rescued." But they both knew that was a lie. Bora died that night, her hand still in Taejun's. Insu checked her pulse, confirmed what everyone already knew, and moved on to the next patient. There was no time for grief, no energy for mourning. Lieutenant Sungmin called a meeting of the surviving officers the next morning. There were fewer than 80 soldiers left alive, and less than half of those were in any condition to travel. "We can't all stay here," Sungmin said bluntly. "The supplies won't last. I'm taking 50 soldiers down to the valley." There was a settlement marked on the maps from the orbital surveys. Ruins, but possibly shelter and resources. "The rest will stay here and maintain the signal beacon." Taejun was among those chosen to stay. So was Medical Officer Insu, who was too exhausted to march any further. They watched Sungmin lead his group out of the caves into the snow, and none of them believed they would see those soldiers again. They were right. The group sent back no communications. Days passed with no word. Then weeks. The beacon signal continued transmitting its automated distress call, but no response came from the orbital fleet. The soldiers in the caves died one by one. Starvation, disease, exposure, despair. Each morning brought new bodies. Each evening brought the fear that you might not wake up the next day. Insu was the last officer besides Taejun. The medical officer had pushed himself beyond all limits, treating patients until he collapsed from exhaustion. On the 35th day, Taejun found him dead in his sleeping bag, his face peaceful for the first time in weeks. Taejun counted the survivors that morning. 5. Just 5 soldiers left out of 500. By evening, 2 more had died. By the next morning, the other 2 were gone. Private Taejun, 23 years old, sat alone in a cave on Earth and realized he was the only one left. The silence was absolute except for the wind howling outside. The darkness was complete except for the small fire he maintained. The loneliness was crushing. He should have felt despair. Part of him did. But another part, the part that had been reading the human survival manual every night, the part that had been paying attention to Earth's patterns and rhythms, understood something important. The expedition had failed because they had tried to conquer Earth. They had approached it as soldiers, as conquerors, as beings who could impose their will on nature through technology and force. Earth had proven them wrong at every turn. To survive Earth, you couldn't fight it. You had to become part of it. You had to adapt. Taejun looked at the survival manual lying beside his sleeping bag and made a decision. He wasn't going to die here. He was going to live. And he was going to learn how humans had managed to thrive on this death world. The expedition reached the ridge on the 8th day, or what remained of the expedition. Of the 500 soldiers who had landed on Earth, fewer than 350 were still alive. They climbed the final slope in silence, too exhausted for the celebration that should have accompanied reaching their objective. The view from the top would have been beautiful under different circumstances. Rolling hills covered in green stretched to the horizon, broken by rivers that caught the sunlight. But Tae-jun saw only more territory where death could be hiding, more distance they might have to cross if things got worse. They began setting up the new camp immediately. The ridge offered better visibility and some protection from the forest below, but everyone knew it was just another temporary measure. Earth had proven that nowhere was truly safe. Captain High Rim looked older than she had 2 weeks ago. The gray in her hair seemed more prominent, the lines around her eyes deeper. She stood near the communications equipment while Bora worked to boost the signal, desperate to reach the orbital fleet and request evacuation or at least reinforcements. Anything? The captain asked. Bora shook her head. The atmospheric interference is worse up here, not better. I can send a basic distress signal, but I can't establish two-way communication. Keep trying, High-Rim said, then walked away to inspect the perimeter. Tae-jun was assigned to a scouting party led by Lieutenant Sung-min. Their mission was to explore the area east of the ridge, mapping resources and threats. It was the kind of routine patrol that had become anything but routine on Earth. The party consisted of 12 soldiers, including Jae-won, who carried the heavy plasma cannon with the same confidence he had shown at the beginning of the mission, though now that confidence had been tempered by experience. They moved carefully down the eastern slope, weapons ready, eyes scanning constantly. They found the ruins an hour into the patrol. At first, Tae-jun thought the shapes were just unusual rock formations. Then he recognized them for what they were, buildings or what remained of buildings. Walls of concrete and steel, broken and overgrown with vegetation, stood like tombstones in a clearing. Human construction, Lieutenant Sung-min said, running his hand over a section of wall. Pre-collapse, probably. The soldiers spread out, exploring the ruins carefully. Most of the structures had collapsed completely, leaving only foundations and scattered debris. But one building, smaller than the others, remained partially intact. Tae-jun pushed through the doorway, his rifle light cutting through the darkness inside. The interior was filled with the detritus of abandoned lives. Furniture rotted into shapeless lumps, papers turned to mulch by time and moisture, pieces of technology so corroded that they were unrecognizable. But on one wall, protected by an overhang that had kept out most of the rain, Tae-jun found something that made him stop. Writing. Human writing, faded but still legible. And beneath it, a small book wrapped in deteriorating plastic that had somehow kept it mostly intact. He picked up the book carefully. The cover was stained and warped, but he could read the title stamped into it. Wilderness Survival Manual. Find something? Jae-won asked from the doorway. Tae-jun held up the book. Information. Maybe useful information. Lieutenant Sung-min examined the book with interest. Take it. Command will want to see anything we find about human adaptation techniques. They continued exploring the ruins, finding more evidence of human habitation, scattered tools, remnants of clothing, even what looked like a child's toy buried in the dirt. Each object told a story of people who had lived here, who had survived here despite everything this planet could throw at them. The attack happened on their way back to the ridge. The pack of wild dogs appeared without warning, flowing around the soldiers like water, cutting off escape routes with practiced efficiency. These weren't the mindless predators the soldiers had expected. These animals hunted with intelligence, working together to isolate targets. Jae-won opened fire with the plasma cannon, but the dogs were too fast, too agile. They darted between trees, using the terrain to their advantage. One leaped at a soldier's throat before anyone could react. Another brought down a man from behind, its jaws closing around his leg and pulling him to the ground. Tae-jun fired his rifle, dropping one dog but missing another that swerved at the last second. Beside him, Lieutenant Sung-min was shouting orders, trying to organize a defense, but the chaos was too complete. Jae-won turned to fire at a dog approaching from his left. He didn't see the one coming from his right. The animal hit him at full speed, knocking him backward. The plasma cannon discharged wildly as Jae-won fell, cutting a burning line across a tree trunk. Tae-jun ran toward his friend, but he was too far away. The dog's jaws closed around Jae-won's throat, and the big soldier's eyes went wide with shock. He clawed at the animal, trying to pry it loose, but his strength was fading fast. Other soldiers finally drove the dog off, killing it with concentrated fire, but the damage was done. Tae-jun dropped to his knees beside Jae-won, pressing his hands against the wound, trying to stop the bleeding. Blood pumped between his fingers, hot and slick. Medic, Someone was screaming. "We need Medical Officer Insu." But Insu was back at camp and they were too far away. Taejun looked into Jaewon's eyes and saw his friend's awareness fading. Jaewon's lips moved, trying to form words, but only blood came out. "Stay with me," Taejun whispered desperately. "Help is coming. Just stay with me." Jaewon's hand found Taejun's arm and gripped it weakly. Then the grip relaxed and the light went out of his eyes. The patrol made it back to camp having lost 4 soldiers to the dogs. Lieutenant Sung-min was wounded, deep scratches across his chest that Insu cleaned and bandaged. The medical officer worked in silence, his movements mechanical, his face expressionless. Taejun recognized the look. Insu had stopped feeling shocked by death. Now he just processed casualties like data points. That night, a storm rolled over the ridge. Not as violent as the first one they had experienced, but bad enough. Lightning struck a supply tent, starting a fire that spread before anyone could react. The soldiers fought the flames desperately, but the wind drove the fire faster than they could control it. Another 10 soldiers died in the inferno, trapped in tents or overcome by smoke. By morning, the expedition had been reduced to fewer than 300 survivors. Captain Hyrim stood before them, her uniform torn and smoke-stained, and tried to project confidence she clearly no longer felt. "We will survive this," she said. "We must survive this. The fleet needs to know what happened here. Our mission has changed from colonization to documentation. We document this world's dangers so others can prepare. That's our duty now." Lieutenant Sung-min, his chest wrapped in bandages, stepped forward. "We're dividing into smaller groups," he announced. "Spread out positions to minimize casualties from concentrated attacks. Each group maintains communication with the others. We hold this ridge until rescue arrives." Bora managed to send a compressed data burst to the orbital fleet that afternoon. Just a few seconds of transmission before the interference cut her off again, but enough to send a basic message. Earth is not viable. Earth is a graveyard. Do not send reinforcements. Whether the message reached the fleet, nobody knew. The lack of response could mean many things, none of them good. Taejun spent his nights reading the survival manual he had found. By flashlight in his tent, he studied techniques the humans had developed for living on this world. How to find safe water by observing animal behavior. How to read weather patterns in the clouds and wind. How to build shelters that could withstand Earth's violent storms. How to identify dangerous plants and animals. One passage, underlined heavily by whoever had owned the book, read, "Adaptation is not optional on Earth. You adapt or you die. There is no third choice." On the 14th day, the sky darkened with smoke. A forest fire was burning to the south, driven north by strong winds. The soldiers watched the flames approach with helpless dread. There was nowhere to run that they could reach before the fire overtook them. Captain Hyrim made the hardest decision of her command. She ordered all non-essential personnel to shelter in the ravine, on the north side of the ridge, while a volunteer force would create a firebreak by burning the vegetation nearest to camp. Taejun volunteered to stay. So did Bora, Lieutenant Sung-min, Insu, and 60 others. They worked frantically, using controlled burns to clear a defensive line, fighting against time and wind. The main fire arrived like a living thing, roaring and crackling, turning the sky orange. The heat was unbelievable, intense enough that Taejun's suit's cooling system struggled to keep up. Smoke choked the air despite the filters. Ash fell like black snow. The firebreak held barely. The flames reached the cleared line and found nothing to burn, eventually dying or redirecting around the ridge. But the victory came with a cost. 32 soldiers had died from smoke inhalation, heat exhaustion, or burns. 2 more had simply run into the fire in panic, their minds broken by weeks of constant horror. Captain Hyrim was among the casualties. A burning tree had collapsed as she was pulling a wounded soldier to safety, crushing them both. Lieutenant Sung-min found her body after the fire passed. She was still holding the other soldier's hand. The first soldier died before the sun came up. Private Hansol had been on perimeter duty when something dragged him into the forest. His scream cut through the darkness for just 3 seconds before ending abruptly. By the time the response team reached his position, they found only his rifle and a trail of blood leading into the trees. The search party that went after him found nothing except torn pieces of his uniform caught on branches. Captain Hyrim ordered the perimeter pulled back and doubled the guard posts. Nobody slept after that. When dawn finally came, it brought no comfort. The sunlight revealed a world that looked deceptively peaceful, but the soldiers had learned their lesson. Medical Officer In-Soo examined the blood samples from Han Sol's site and found saliva mixed in that belonged to no species in the Union database. Whatever had taken the soldier was completely unknown. "We need to be more careful," In-Soo told Captain Hiram quietly. "Our medical protocols weren't designed for this planet's biology." The captain nodded grimly. "Increase the watch rotation. Nobody goes into the forest without a full squad." But being careful wasn't enough. Not on Earth. By the third day, 17 soldiers were dead. Some had encountered animals that looked harmless until they attacked with surprising speed and strength. Others had developed breathing problems despite their atmosphere filters, their lungs reacting to particles and allergens that hadn't appeared in any of the pre-mission scans. 3 soldiers had simply collapsed during routine patrols, their bodies unable to handle the constant strain of Earth's heavier gravity. Taejun watched it all happen with growing dread. He had been assigned to help set up water purification systems, and even that simple task had become dangerous. The river water looked clean, but contained microscopic organisms that had already sent 4 soldiers to the medical tent with violent illnesses. In-Soo worked without rest, trying to treat conditions he had never encountered before, watching helplessly as soldiers died from infections that resisted every medication in his supply. "This doesn't make sense," Bo-Ra said during a brief rest period. She sat beside Taejun outside the command tent, her face drawn with exhaustion. "The surveys said this planet was viable. How could they get it so wrong?" "Maybe they never actually sent anyone down before," Taejun replied. "Maybe they just scanned from orbit and made assumptions." The 4th night brought a storm that nearly destroyed the entire camp. The wind arrived without warning, howling through the trees with force that bent the trunks like grass. Rain fell in sheets so thick that visibility dropped to nothing. Lightning struck close enough that Taejun felt his hair stand on end, and thunder shook the ground beneath his feet. The supply depot's weather shields failed within the first hour. Water poured through the gaps, ruining food stores and damaging equipment. 2 soldiers were struck by flying debris and killed instantly. Another was swept away when a flash flood turned a dry stream bed into a raging torrent. Taejun and Jae-won worked together to secure the communications equipment, fighting against wind that threatened to tear them off their feet. The rain was cold, far colder than their climate data had predicted, and it soaked through their supposedly waterproof gear within minutes. "We need to evacuate," Jae-won shouted over the wind. "Call the fleet." But Bo-Ra was already trying. The atmospheric interference was too strong. Her communications equipment could barely receive signals, let alone send them. The fleet in orbit might as well have been in another galaxy for all the help they could provide. The storm lasted 6 hours. When it finally passed, leaving behind a gray dawn and devastated camp, Captain Hiram called for a casualty count. 23 more soldiers were dead or missing. Another 30 were injured badly enough that they couldn't continue active duty. The expedition had been on the ground for less than a week, and they had already lost nearly 1/10 of their force. Lieutenant Sung-min suggested they move to higher ground, somewhere more defensible. The captain agreed, though Taejun could see the doubt in her eyes. Where exactly on this planet was safe? They broke camp the next morning, organizing into columns for the march. The route would take them through forest terrain toward a ridge visible in the distance. According to their maps, the higher elevation would give them better communication with the orbital fleet and more visibility of the surrounding area. Taejun's unit marched near the middle of the column, with Bo-Ra close by. The forest pressed in on both sides of the narrow trail, and every shadow seemed to hide threats. The soldiers kept their weapons ready, jumping at every sound. The attack came at midday. The creature burst from the undergrowth with a roar that froze Taejun's blood. It was massive, easily 3 times the size of a man, covered in thick brown fur and moving with terrifying speed. Taejun had a single moment to process what he was seeing before the animal. A bear, according to his helmet's database, crashed into the front of the column. Chaos erupted. Soldiers opened fire, but their energy weapons designed for piercing armor seemed to do little against the creature's thick hide and dense muscle. The bear swatted aside 2 soldiers with one massive paw, sending them flying into the trees. Its jaws closed around another soldier's torso and the screaming started. More soldiers fired, finally bringing the creature down, but not before it had killed 5 people and wounded 8 more. The column ground to a halt as medics rushed forward. Insu moved among the wounded with practiced efficiency, but Taijun could see the hopelessness in his eyes. The injuries were too severe, the damage too extensive. What kind of world has animals like this? Jaewon breathed, staring at the dead bear. Up close it was even more impressive and terrifying. Its claws were as long as Taejun's hand, its teeth designed to crush bone. A world that kills the weak, Lieutenant Sungmin said quietly. He was looking at the casualties with an expression Taejun had never seen on the strict officer's face before: fear. They buried the dead quickly and continued moving. Nobody wanted to stay in one place for long. The forest had become a nightmare, every tree a potential hiding spot for horrors they couldn't predict. That night, the insects came. They arrived, in clouds drawn by the lights and the smell of the soldiers. Small flying things that bit and stung, leaving welts that burned and itched unbearably. The soldiers tried to seal their tents, but the insects found every gap, every opening. By morning, half the camp was covered in bites, and 3 soldiers had died from allergic reactions so severe that their throats had swollen shut before Insu could help them. Captain Hirim called an emergency meeting of the officers. Taijun stood guard outside the command tent and listened to the raised voices within. The captain wanted to push forward. Lieutenant Sungmin argued for requesting immediate evacuation. Other officers spoke over each other, their fear and frustration clear. In the end, Hirim made the decision. They would continue to the ridge. Once there, they would establish a permanent base and wait for reinforcements. The mission could still be salvaged. They just needed to adapt. But Earth didn't care about their plans. The next 3 days brought more deaths. A soldier stepped on a snake hidden in the grass and died from venom before Insu could treat him. Another squad encountered what looked like a pack of wild dogs, but these animals hunted with coordinated tactics that would have impressed military strategists. 6 soldiers died in that engagement, dragged down by creatures that seemed to predict their every move. The water remained unsafe despite all their purification efforts. The air continued to trigger breathing problems. The temperature swung wildly between freezing nights and scorching afternoons. Soldiers collapsed from exhaustion, from dehydration, from infections that spread faster than they could be treated. Taejun kept moving, kept following orders, but he could see the truth that everyone else was beginning to understand. Earth wasn't just dangerous. It was actively hostile to their presence, as if the planet itself was rejecting them. On the 7th night, as Taijun sat watch beside Bo-Ra, she asked the question they were all thinking. Do you think the humans who lived here were really weak, like the Union said? Taejun looked out at the dark forest, listening to the countless sounds of life that filled the night. No, he said quietly. I think they were incredibly strong, and I think we're starting to understand why. The council chamber stretched high above the gathered representatives, its crystalline walls reflecting light from a dozen different star systems. Ambassador Velthar of the Galactic Union stood at the podium, his 3 eyes gleaming with satisfaction as he gestured toward the holographic display floating before them. The blue and green planet rotated slowly, looking peaceful and inviting. Earth, he announced, his voice carrying across the vast chamber. A Class 7 viable world. Abundant water, oxygen-rich atmosphere, and no sentient species to complicate colonization. The humans who once claimed it have been extinct for 2 centuries. In the viewing gallery above, Private Taijun sat with his hands folded in his lap, watching the proceedings with quiet attention. He was 23 years old, thin and wiry, with dark eyes that took in everything without seeming to stare. Around him, his fellow soldiers whispered excitedly about the opportunity before them. The Korean Federation had volunteered 500 troops to claim Earth for the Union. It was supposed to be a simple mission, a show of strength and capability. Look at it, whispered Private Jaewon from the seat beside him. The heavy-set soldier grinned widely, his confidence evident in every gesture. We'll plant our flag and be home in a month. Easiest deployment ever. Taejun said nothing. Something about the planet made him uneasy, though he couldn't explain why. His grandmother had told him stories about Earth when he was a child, Tales passed down through generations about the human homeworld. She had called it beautiful and terrible in the same breath, but those were just stories, weren't they? The humans had been gone for so long that most of their history had been lost. Captain Highrim stood near the front of the gallery, her uniform pressed and perfect, her gray-streaked hair pulled back severely. She had served in 3 campaigns and carried herself with the certainty of someone who had seen combat and survived. When the briefing ended, she turned to address her troops. "Listen carefully," she said, her voice cutting through the chatter. "This mission is straightforward. We land, establish a perimeter, survey the resources, and hold the territory until the colonization fleet arrives. The Union expects professionalism. Don't embarrass the Federation." Lieutenant Sungmin, standing beside her, nodded sharply. He was younger than the captain, but already had a reputation for following protocol to the letter. "We have superior technology and training," he added. "The wildlife on Earth is documented as manageable. Standard defensive measures will be more than adequate." Corporal Bora caught Taejun's eye from across the gallery and smiled. She was the communications specialist, quick-witted and competent, with a practical streak that Taejun appreciated. They had gone through basic training together and had remained friends ever since. She seemed to sense his unease and gave him a small shrug as if to say, "We'll be fine." Medical Officer In-Soo sat alone near the back, reviewing data on his tablet. He was older than most of the soldiers, methodical and thorough, with steady hands and a calm demeanor. Taejun had watched him work during training exercises and had been impressed by his efficiency. If anyone got hurt, In-Soo was the person you wanted nearby. The next week passed in a blur of preparation. The soldiers loaded equipment onto the transport ships, checked and rechecked their gear, and reviewed the mission parameters. The intelligence reports painted Earth as a paradise waiting to be claimed. Temperate zones with moderate weather, plentiful fresh water, and vegetation that could support agricultural development. The extinct humans had left behind ruins, but nothing that would pose a threat to a modern military force. Taejun spent his free time in the ship's library, accessing what little information remained about humanity. Most of their records had been lost in the cosmic event that had supposedly wiped them out, a massive electromagnetic pulse that had fried their technology and left them vulnerable. The few surviving texts spoke of a species that had spread across their planet, adapting to every environment from frozen tundras to scorching deserts. "Still reading those old files?" Bora asked, dropping into the seat beside him. "Just curious," Taejun replied. "Don't you wonder how they survived for so long without joining the Union?" Bora shrugged. "They were isolated. Lucky, probably. Then their luck ran out." "Maybe," Taejun said, but he wasn't convinced. The day of deployment arrived with military precision. The 500 soldiers assembled in the hangar bay, standing in perfect formation as Captain Highrim inspected the ranks. The transport ships hummed with power, ready to carry them down to the surface. Through the massive viewports, Earth filled the view, its clouds swirling in hypnotic patterns. "Remember your training," Captain Highrim called out. "Stay alert, follow orders, and watch each other's backs. We're making history today." The soldiers cheered, their voices echoing off the metal walls. Jaewon punched Taejun's shoulder playfully. "Here we go, brother. Easy mission, easy glory." Taejun managed to smile, though the unease in his stomach had grown stronger. He checked his rifle one more time, making sure everything was in order. Beside him, Bo-Ra adjusted her communications pack, her expression focused and professional. The descent took 40 minutes. The transport ships entered Earth's atmosphere with barely a shudder, their advanced shielding handling the friction effortlessly. Through the windows, Taejun watched the ground rush up to meet them. Dense forests stretched in every direction, broken occasionally by rivers that glinted in the sunlight. It looked exactly like the reports had described, beautiful and inviting. The landing zone was a large clearing surrounded by towering trees. The ships touched down softly, their landing gear compressing slightly on the soft earth. The rear hatches opened with a hiss of equalizing pressure, and the soldiers filed out in organized units. Taejun stepped onto Earth for the first time and immediately noticed something wrong. The gravity felt different, heavier somehow, though his suit's reading said it should be comfortable. The air that filtered through his helmet carried strange scents, sharp and organic in a way that ship-recycled atmosphere never achieved. Everything seemed louder here, more alive. "Spread out," Lieutenant Sungmin ordered. Establish the perimeter. Engineering teams begin setting up the base camp. The soldiers moved with practiced efficiency, fanning out across the clearing. Some began unpacking equipment, while others took up defensive positions at the tree line. Captain High Rim stood near the command post, watching the operation with satisfaction. Tai Jun was assigned to a patrol unit along the eastern perimeter. As he walked toward the forest edge, his boots pressing into soil that felt too soft, too yielding, he noticed how quiet his fellow soldiers had become. The initial excitement had faded, replaced by a subtle tension that none of them could quite name. The trees were enormous, far larger than any Tai Jun had seen on other worlds. Their bark was rough and dark, and their branches created a canopy so thick that the forest floor beneath them lay in perpetual shadow. Something moved in those shadows just beyond clear sight. "You see that?" J1 whispered, his heavy weapon raised slightly. "Probably just an animal," another soldier replied, but his voice lacked certainty. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that seemed too vivid, too intense. As darkness began to fall over the landing zone, the soldiers activated their lights and continued their work. Nobody spoke about the sounds that came from the forest, the rustling and calls of creatures they couldn't identify. Tae-jun stood his watch at the perimeter, staring into the darkness beyond the lights, and wondered what they had really gotten themselves into. The first thing Tae-jun did was stop thinking like a soldier and start thinking like a survivor. He went through the remaining supplies methodically, separating what was essential from what was useless. The high-tech equipment that had seemed so important when they landed, the weapons designed for fighting other soldiers, the communications gear that couldn't reach anyone, all of it was just weight now. He kept the basics: a knife, fire-starting materials, water containers, and the survival manual. The second thing he did was leave the caves. They had become a tomb, filled with the frozen bodies of his comrades and the smell of death. Earth's winter was deepening, and staying in one place meant slowly dying. The manual said that humans had survived by moving with the seasons, following food sources, avoiding the worst of the weather. Tae-jun packed what he could carry and walked out into the snow on the morning of his 37th day on Earth. He was alone in a way he had never been before, surrounded by a world that had killed everyone he knew, but he felt strangely calm. Fear was still there, but it had been joined by something else: determination. The first week was the hardest. Tae-jun had to relearn everything: how to walk in snow without exhausting himself, how to find shelter before darkness fell, how to start a fire with half-frozen hands, how to melt snow for drinking water without making himself sick. Every mistake could be fatal, so he learned to move slowly, to think carefully, to observe before acting. He nearly died on the third day when he fell through ice covering a stream. The water was shockingly cold, stealing his breath and numbing his limbs instantly. For a moment, panic took over and he thrashed uselessly. Then training reasserted itself. He stopped fighting, found the current's direction, and let it carry him to shallower water where he could crawl out. Hypothermia was setting in by the time he managed to start a fire. His hands shook so badly he could barely hold the fire starter. His mind was getting foggy, thoughts becoming slow and confused. But he got the fire lit, stripped off his wet clothes, and huddled next to the flames until the shaking stopped and clarity returned. That night, warming himself by the fire and eating a meager meal of emergency rations, Tae-jun understood something the expedition had never grasped. Earth didn't care about your technology or your weapons or your plans. Earth was indifferent. It would kill you without malice or mercy if you made mistakes. The only way to survive was to respect that indifference and adapt to it. The survival manual became his Bible. He read it every night, memorizing its lessons. How to identify edible plants by their characteristics. How to track animals by their prints and droppings. How to predict weather changes by watching the sky and the behavior of wildlife. How to build different types of shelter for different conditions. But reading wasn't enough. He had to practice, to learn through trial and error. He set snares for small animals, failing more often than succeeding at first, but gradually understanding the patterns of where animals traveled and what they sought. He learned to preserve meat by smoking it over his fire, losing several attempts to spoilage before figuring out the right technique. By the second week, Tae-jun had stopped counting himself as part of the expedition. That soldier had died with his comrades. He was becoming something else. something the manual called a survivor. His body was changing too. The constant physical exertion, the limited food, the harsh conditions were burning away everything unnecessary. He was losing weight but gaining endurance. His senses were sharpening from constant use. He started talking to Bora at night, speaking out loud to her memory to keep himself from going mad with loneliness. He told her about what he was learning, about the mistakes he made and the small victories he achieved. Sometimes he imagined her responses, her practical observations and gentle humor. It helped. "You'd be proud of me today," he told her memory one evening. "I caught a rabbit in the snare, cleaned it properly, cooked it all the way through. It actually tasted good. The winter was relentless, but Taijun learned its rhythms. He found caves and overhangs where he could shelter from the worst storms. He learned to move during the warmer parts of the day and conserve energy when the temperature dropped. He discovered that certain evergreen trees had edible inner bark that could supplement his diet when other food was scarce. Most importantly, he learned patience. Earth rewarded careful observation and punished rushed decisions. When he saw predator tracks too fresh, he changed direction. When weather looked threatening, he found shelter early. When water looked suspicious, he boiled it longer. The expedition had failed because they had expected Earth to accommodate them. Taijun survived because he accommodated Earth. He found more human ruins as winter slowly gave way to spring. Scattered settlements, their buildings collapsed and overgrown, but still containing artifacts that told stories. A child's drawing preserved in a metal box showed stick figures of a family standing in front of a house. A journal with water-damaged pages described daily struggles with weather and wildlife. A photograph, faded but recognizable, showed people smiling despite obvious hardship. These humans hadn't been weak. They had been incredibly strong. They had lived on a world that killed casually and constantly, and they had built civilization anyway. They had raised families, created art, found joy in the spaces between survival challenges. The more evidence Taijun found, the more his respect for humanity grew. One day he discovered a small library, its roof partially intact, books scattered everywhere but some still readable. He spent a week there, reading everything he could about human history on Earth. Stories of exploration and adaptation, accounts of people surviving in every environment from frozen poles to scorching deserts, records of technologies developed specifically to cope with Earth's dangers. He read about something called resilience, a human concept that meant the ability to recover from difficulty. Earth had given humans no choice but to develop that quality or die. Every generation had been tested, and those who survived passed on their knowledge and genetics to the next. Over thousands of years, humans had been shaped by this world into something remarkable. Taijun looked at his reflection in a still pool one day and barely recognized himself. His face was leaner, weathered by sun and wind. His eyes looked different, more alert, constantly scanning. His body moved with an efficiency he had never possessed before, every motion purposeful and controlled. The soft soldier who had landed on Earth was gone. Something else had taken his place. Spring brought new challenges, but also new opportunities. Food became more plentiful as plants sprouted and animals emerged from winter dens. The weather was still unpredictable, with sudden storms and temperature swings, but nothing compared to winter's brutality. Taijun felt his confidence growing along with his skills. He also began to understand what it meant to live with Earth rather than against it. When he walked through the forest now, he no longer saw threats around every tree. Instead, he saw patterns, the way certain birds indicated water nearby, how animal behavior warned of approaching storms, which plants grew in which conditions. Earth was still dangerous, still capable of killing him in 1,000 different ways, but it was no longer completely hostile. It was simply itself, and he had learned to read its language. The manual had one passage that Taijun returned to repeatedly. It was written in handwriting rather than printed, added by one of the manual's previous owners. Earth makes you earn every moment of life, but the life you earn is more real, more vivid, more precious than anything you could have in an easier place. We are not strong despite Earth. We are strong because of Earth. By the time summer arrived, Taijun had been alone for 3 months. His supplies from the expedition were nearly exhausted. His uniform had been patched so many times it was more patches than original fabric. His rifle had been abandoned weeks ago when the power cell died, replaced by a spear he had crafted and a bow he had made from flexible wood and salvaged cable. He should have been miserable. Instead, he felt more alive than ever. The constant challenge of survival gave each day purpose and meaning. Small victories, a successful hunt, a comfortable shelter, a night without danger, meant more than any military achievement had. But as summer deepened, Taejun found himself thinking about the orbital fleet, about the Union Council who had sent them here based on incomplete data, about the possibility that more expeditions might be planned, more soldiers sent to die because nobody understood what Earth really was. He had survived. He had adapted. He had become what this world demanded. But survival alone wasn't enough anymore. He needed to return. He needed to testify. He needed to make sure that his 499 dead comrades hadn't died for nothing. The decision made, Taejun began planning his return journey to the original landing site. It was hundreds of kilometers away, through territory he didn't know, facing dangers he couldn't predict. The old Taejun would have called it impossible, but he wasn't the old Taejun anymore. He had been forged by Earth into something new, something capable of attempting the impossible. He packed his few possessions, checked his handmade equipment, and looked south toward where the expedition had first landed. "I'm going back," he told Bora's memory. "I'm going to make them understand.